Welcome to Family Betrayal Revenge. Stay tuned. Have a fun time and let's talk in the comment. Let's go!
I'm Nola Price and I'm 16 years old. Or I was 16 years old when I realized that the people who gave birth to you aren't always the people who want you to survive, aren't always the people who see your life as valuable, as worth protecting, as anything except inconvenience. And standing in that bedroom doorway in a double-wide trailer outside Grants Pass, Oregon with my stepfather Dale backlit by the hallway light, I understood with absolute clarity that I was about to die, not metaphorically, not dramatically, literally die, because the man in that doorway had just been told by my mother Charlene that I was 5 months pregnant, that I was keeping the baby, that I'd refused to make it go away, and his face, his expression, it wasn't anger exactly, it was calculation, was the look of someone doing math, weighing cost versus benefit, and the math he was doing, the equation he was solving, it involved my body, my baby, and whether either of us would be alive by morning, and I'd learned to read that look, had spent 8 years learning the language of violence in that house, learning to decode the difference between the hit that teaches and the hit that destroys, learning to measure the space between his hand raising and my body bracing, learning that survival in a house with Dale meant becoming furniture, becoming invisible, becoming so small that you didn't register as worth the energy of cruelty. But tonight I couldn't be small, couldn't be invisible. Because my belly was rounding, was visible, was evidence of life I'd created without permission, without approval, without considering how it would affect him. And Dale, he didn't tolerate things that affected him without his control, didn't accept that anyone in his house, in his space, could make decisions that impacted his life, his comfort, his dominance, and a pregnant 16-year-old stepdaughter. That was impact, that was disruption, that was challenge to his authority, and Dale didn't negotiate with challenges. He eliminated them, and I was standing in my bedroom wearing boots I'd already laced because I'd known, had understood since my mother slapped me 3 hours earlier, since she'd said Dale's going to kill you. Not as threat but as observation, clinical and detached, like she was reading weather, that this moment was coming, was inevitable, was the natural conclusion of years of him hitting me and her watching, of him correcting me and her enabling, of him existing as violence and her existing as witness. And the door opened and Dale stepped through, and his fist moved faster than I could dodge, caught my temple, not my stomach. Even Dale had lines he told himself he wouldn't cross, distinctions he made that allowed him to sleep, allowed him to believe he wasn't monster, just man asserting control. And I hit the wall, slid sideways, felt my elbow crack against the baseboard heater, felt heat and cold simultaneously, felt my body doing what it had learned to do: curl, protect, make yourself smaller, wrap around the baby, around the life inside you that doesn't understand what's happening, doesn't know that the world it's about to enter is this. Is violence disguised as family? Is cruelty justified as discipline? Is this room, this trailer, this man whose boot was coming for my back, once, twice, and then my mother was there, was pulling him off, was saying stop, not because she cared about me, not because maternal instinct finally activated, but because the neighbors were home, because the walls were thin, because violence that leaves evidence, that creates witnesses, that risks police involvement, that was problem, that was inconvenience, that was line even she wouldn't cross, not for moral reasons, for practical ones. And she looked at me, looked at her daughter curled on the floor with blood in her mouth and bruises already forming and belly protecting unborn life. And she said, "Get out." 2 words, and she wasn't talking to Dale. Wasn't telling the man who'd just beaten her pregnant daughter to leave. She was talking to me. Was telling the victim to go, to disappear, to solve the problem by removing herself. And I understood then, understood with the kind of clarity that only comes from absolute betrayal, that my mother, Charlene, the woman who'd carried me, who'd given birth to me, who'd supposedly loved me, she'd made choice, had been making choice for years, had chosen Dale over me consistently, repeatedly, permanently, had calculated that her comfort, her stability, her relationship with man who hit children was more valuable than her daughter's safety, more important than her daughter's life. And that choice, that selection, it wasn't new, wasn't spontaneous, was culmination of 8 years of smaller choices, of moments where she could have intervened and didn't, could have protected and chose not to, could have been mother and decided instead to be bystander, and bystanders I'd learned were just perpetrators who didn't want to get their hands dirty, were just people who decided that watching violence was morally different from committing it, was somehow less guilty, somehow forgivable, except it wasn't at all, was actually worse because at least Dale was honest about what he was violence without pretense, was cruelty that didn't apologize, but Charlene, she pretended, performed, put on mask of concern while doing absolutely nothing, while enabling everything, while creating conditions where her daughter learned that asking for help was pointless, that protection wasn't coming, that survival meant depending on nobody, trusting nothing, accepting that family was just word people used to justify treating you worse than they'd treat strangers. I got up, grabbed my jacket, the only warm thing I owned, walked through the front door into October cold, into night that was dark and clear and so cold it hurt to breathe, and the screen door banged shut behind me with sound like period at end of sentence, like conclusion, like ending, and I walked, didn't run. Walking implies panic, and panic burns energy you can't afford to waste. Walked with purpose, with direction. With $27 I'd stolen from Dale's ashtray while he slept. With bruise forming across my temple, with blood I could taste, with baby inside me that was 5 months along, that had been moving, that had been fluttering like moth under silk. That was reason I'd refused to make it go away, because this baby, this life, it was first thing in my entire existence that was mine, was created by me, was dependent on me, was looking to me for protection the way I'd looked to my mother and found nothing, and I wasn't going to be nothing, wasn't going to be absence, wasn't going to be the person who watched while someone vulnerable suffered. I was going to be different, was going to protect, was going to keep this baby alive, even if keeping it alive meant walking into wilderness with $27 and no plan beyond survival, beyond staying alive until I could figure out next step, beyond breathing and moving, and refusing to let Dale's violence, my mother's abandonment, the systematic destruction of my childhood become the thing that defined my future, that determined my baby's future, that wrote the story of what happened to a girl who got pregnant at 16 in house where love was performed but never delivered, where family was word used to trap rather than protect, where staying meant dying and leaving meant maybe, possibly, surviving. I walked 3 miles to Greyhound Station, sat on bench outside because station was locked, because bus didn't leave until morning, sat in cold that made my breath visible, that made my fingers numb, that crept into my bones and settled there like it was planning to stay, and I put my hands on my belly on the place where baby was, where life was growing despite everything, despite violence, despite poverty, despite the fact that I was 16 and alone, and had nowhere to go, nothing to offer. Except determination, except refusal to die, except understanding that some lives are worth fighting for even when you have no weapons, no resources, no support except your own stubborn insistence that you matter, that your baby matters, that survival is achievable if you're willing to do whatever survival requires. And I said out loud, said to the baby, said to myself, said to the universe that had given me Dale and Charlene and violence disguised as family, I said I'm going to figure this out. I promise I'm going to keep you alive, and that promise, that commitment, it was first honest thing I'd said in years, was first time I'd made promise I actually intended to keep, because promises in that house had meant nothing, had been words people said to buy time, to manipulate, to control, but this promise, this one, it was different, was real, was foundation of everything that came next, and what came next was decision, was choice, was plan that wasn't really plan, more like direction. South into mountains, into Cascade Wilderness, into forest where nobody owned land, where living off-grid was possible, where people who didn't fit anywhere else went to disappear, and disappearing sounded like paradise to a girl whose entire life had been about being seen by wrong people, being noticed by wrong eyes, being available to wrong hands, and I spent $14 on bus ticket to Prospect, spent 8 more on water and crackers, walked past last house on last road, kept walking, until road became trail, trail became suggestion, suggestion became nothing except trees and silence and cold, and the understanding that I'd chosen wilderness over family, had chosen unknown over known violence, had chosen maybe dying alone over definitely dying in that trailer. And that choice, that selection, it wasn't easy, wasn't comfortable, wasn't the kind of thing people celebrate, but it was mine, was the first decision I'd made that was entirely my own, that nobody forced, that nobody manipulated, that reflected what I valued rather than what I was told to value, and what I valued was life, was survival, was keeping myself and my baby alive long enough to figure out what came next, and what came next was 3 days of walking, of stumbling, of following creeks uphill, because Silas would later tell me that's how you get away from valleys where people search. 3 days of learning that hunger has stages. First the gnawing, then the headache, then strange lightness where your body stops asking and starts accepting. 3 days of sleeping on pine needles, of drinking from creeks, of walking through forest that was ancient, was indifferent, was neither hostile nor welcoming, just existed, just provided what it provided, and took what it took, and didn't care whether 16-year-old pregnant girl survived or died, because mountains don't care, forests don't care. Nature doesn't have opinions about human suffering, just absorbs it, just witnesses it, just continues regardless. I need to pause here and ask you something, and I really want you to think about this. Type escape if you've ever had to choose between family and survival. Type running if you know what it feels like to walk away from people who should have protected you. Because what I was doing, walking into mountains alone and pregnant, that wasn't bravery, that was calculation, was understanding that staying meant dying, and leaving meant maybe not dying. And when those are your options, when violence is certainty and wilderness is possibility, you choose possibility, you choose maybe, you choose the unknown, because at least unknown hasn't hit you yet, hasn't told you you're worthless, hasn't made it clear through action and inaction that your life is less valuable than someone else's comfort. And I want you to understand, need you to see, that this moment, this choice, it wasn't dramatic, wasn't heroic, was just next step in series of steps that started 8 years earlier when Dale moved in. When Charlene decided that having man was more important than protecting daughter, when pattern was established, when foundation was laid for moment when pregnant teenager would choose freezing in forest over staying in house with people who claimed to love her, and that choice, that moment, it tells you everything about what family had meant, what home had been, what love had looked like in house, where hitting was correcting, where watching was enabling, where surviving meant becoming so small. You barely existed. On third day, on the day I would later count as October 17th, though I'd stopped tracking dates, stopped caring about calendar, stopped measuring time in anything except daylight and darkness. On that day, I was bleeding from branch cut across my cheek, was stumbling more than walking, was in that stage of exhaustion where your body moves but your mind doesn't quite track what it's doing, was 5 months pregnant and 3 days without real food, and my back was canvas of purple and black from Dale's boots, and I was cold, was so cold that cold had stopped being sensation and become fact, become reality, become the thing you are rather than thing you feel, and I smelled it before I saw it, smelled with smoke, faint, almost imagined, but there, and I followed it the way drowning person follows surface, the way desperate follows hope, and I crested ridge that was so gentle I didn't realize I was climbing until I was on top, and below me in shallow valley ringed by old growth. Douglas Firs was cabin, not abandoned hunter shack, real cabin, built from logs weathered to color of iron, 2 stories with stone chimney rising above roofline, with porch wrapping around front, with door that was slightly open, just crack, and through that crack leaked thin line of warm amber light, and smoke curled from chimney, and I stood on that ridge understanding that what I did next would determine everything, would either save me or destroy me, because doors that are slightly open, I knew about those, knew that what waited on other side could be salvation or could be next version of thing I was running from, and I'd spent lifetime walking through doors that promised warmth and delivered pain, but I was pregnant, was starving, was freezing, was at end of resources that had never been adequate, and this door, this cabin, this smoke rising into October sky, it was only option, was last chance, was the thing I either walked toward or died avoiding, and I chose walking toward, chose risk, chose possibility. Because dying alone in forest wasn't noble, wasn't peaceful, was just dying, and if I was going to die anyway, I might as well die trying, might as well die having knocked on door, having asked for help, having done everything possible rather than nothing, and I descended ridge slowly, crossed clearing, approached porch where tools hung neat and organized, where firewood was stacked with precision, where boots sat caked in mud pointing outward, and I raised hand to knock. And before my knuckles touched wood, door swung open and man stood there, tall and thin in way that suggested he'd been broader once, with gray hair and lined face and eyes that were pale blue or gray, hard to tell in lantern light, and he looked at me the way you look at deer that wandered onto your porch, observing, measuring, deciding, and I opened my mouth to speak, to explain, to justify, but my body betrayed me, my knees buckled, edges of vision darkened, and last thing I saw before ground rushed up was man stepping forward, hands reaching out, warm light from inside cabin spilling past him like hell breath finally released, and I thought this is it. This is where I either die or survive, where stranger either helps or hurts, where wilderness either gives or takes, And then there was nothing, just darkness, just the absence of consciousness, just the falling that comes when body decides it's done. It's finished carrying you. You're on your own now, except I wasn't on my own. Wasn't alone, because when I woke up, I was on floor that was warm, covered by wool blanket, head resting on rolled jacket, and man sat in chair 10 feet away watching me with those still water eyes. And he said, "You fainted." And I said, "How long?" And he said, "Maybe 20 minutes. And he held out tin cup and said, "Broth, venison, drink it slow, or it'll come back up." And I took that cup and wrapped both hands around warmth, and I said, "I'm pregnant." Said it as warning, as disclosure, as way of saying, "I come with complications, decide now." And he said, "I know, saw it when you walked up." And I said, "I don't have anywhere to go. I'm not asking to stay. I just needed to rest." And he said, "How far along?" And I said, 5 months. And he said, "Who hit you?" And that question, that direct, unflinching question, it landed like stone dropped into silence. And I touched my face, touched bruise I'd almost forgotten. And I said, "My stepfather." And he nodded like he'd already known, like he was just confirming. And he said, "There's more broth on stove. Finish that first. There's cot in back room I don't use. Stay the night. We'll sort the rest in morning." And he stood and walked to wood stove and started doing something that didn't require my involvement. And I sat there holding tin cup that was still warm, that smelled like meat and salt and survival. And I understood that I'd just walked through door that was slightly open and found on other side not violence, not cruelty, not the thing I'd been running from, but something else. Something I didn't have name for yet, not safety exactly, I didn't trust safety, but absence of immediate danger. And for 16-year-old girl who'd spent 8 years calculating threat levels, measuring distances to exits, planning escapes from people who claimed to love her, absence of danger was enough, was more than enough, was everything. And I drank that broth slowly, let warmth spread through body that had been cold for so long I had forgotten what warm felt like. And outside wind moved through pines with sound like breathing, and inside fire crackled and lanterns swayed, and for first time in 3 days, maybe for first time in years, I felt something that wasn't fear, wasn't calculation, wasn't the constant surveillance of predicting violence. I felt the possibility of rest, of stopping, of existing without bracing, and that possibility, that tiny fragile possibility, it was beginning, was foundation, was the first moment of life that would eventually become mine, that would eventually be worth living, that would eventually prove that surviving wasn't enough, that thriving was achievable, that girl who'd been thrown away, who'd walked into mountains pregnant and alone, who'd chosen wilderness over family, that girl was going to make it, was going to survive, was going to build something from nothing, and that building, that creation, that transformation from victim to survivor to something beyond survivor, that was starting. Now, was beginning in this cabin, with this broth, with this stranger who hadn't asked for my story, hadn't demanded explanation, had just offered warmth and distance, and the kind of basic human decency that felt revolutionary after 16 years of learning that people who claim to love you can watch you suffer, and call it discipline, can participate in your destruction and call it family, can systematically destroy your sense of worth and call it normal. And I was done with normal, done with family that meant violence, done with love that required suffering, and I was ready, was absolutely ready, to learn what came next, what happened when you chose yourself over people who hurt you, what life looked like when you built it from scratch with nothing except determination and strangers' unexpected kindness, and baby growing inside you that depended on you to be different, to be better, to be person who protected rather than person who watched. And I was going to be that person, was going to protect, was going to survive, was going to prove that Dale was wrong, that Charlene was wrong, that everyone who decided I was disposable was wrong. And that wrongness, that magnificent, beautiful wrongness, it was about to be demonstrated, about to be proven, about to become story. And that story was just beginning. The man's name was Silas, and I learned this on the second morning not because he offered it, but because I found it carved into the handle of the axe on the porch. Small letters, neat, cut deep into wood with blade that didn't waver. Silas, no last name. And when I asked, he confirmed it with single nod and nothing more. Didn't ask for mine in return, but I gave it anyway. Standing in doorway of back room where I'd slept on cot that was real, that had canvas mattress and wool blanket that smelled like cedar and smoke, and the quiet man who'd handed it to me without explanation, I said, "I'm Nola." And he said, "I heard you the first time," which confused me because I hadn't told him before. And then I realized I must have said it while fading out on porch, that he'd been listening even when I thought I was gone. And that was first thing I learned about Silas, that he heard everything, even things you didn't mean to say, even words that slipped out when consciousness was slipping away. And the second thing I learned was that he had rules, not house rules posted on wall, not the kind Dale enforced with his hands. Silas's rules were structural the way load-bearing walls are structural. They held shape of the day, and without them the day would collapse, rise before sun, stoke fire before anything else because cabin lost heat overnight and cold crept in through floorboards like something alive. Eat what's available and don't waste it. Haul water from creek quarter-mile south while morning air was still sharp enough to keep you alert. Split wood in afternoon when your muscles were warm and your judgment was steady. Check snare line before dusk. Eat again. Bank the fire, sleep, and he didn't tell me these rules, didn't explain them, didn't post them or announce them. He just did them and I watched, and the pattern became visible the way trail becomes visible when you stop looking for it and just walk. And on third day he handed me bucket and said creeks that way, pointing south, follow the sound, don't take the steep bank. Go 50 yards past it and there's grade you can manage, and I took bucket. Didn't ask why he wasn't doing it himself. Understood the exchange, not payment but participation. He'd given me shelter and warmth and broth that had probably saved my life and the baby's. The least I could carry was water, and the creek was exactly where he said it was. And the gentle grade was exactly 50 yards past steep bank, and water ran cold and clear over stone's color of rust, and sound of it filled space between trees like conversation I wasn't part of but was welcome to overhear. And I carried bucket back sloshing only a little and set it on porch, and Silas glanced at water level, then at me, and said good. One word, but the way he said it, the slight nod, the brief meeting of eyes, told me it was most praise he had available, and it was enough, was more than enough, because nobody in all of my 16 years had ever looked at thing I'd done and said good without qualification, without criticism, without suggestion for how I could have done it better, faster, more correctly. And that single word, that acknowledgement, it meant more than flowery praise from people who didn't mean it, meant more than Charlene's performances of maternal approval that always came with price tag, with expectation, with debt I'd be expected to repay. Silas's good was just good, was observation, was fact, was recognition that I'd done thing correctly, and that correctness stood on its own without needing elaboration. And I felt something in my chest loosen, felt weight I hadn't known I was carrying shift slightly, felt the beginning of understanding that maybe, possibly, there were people in world who didn't need you to be perfect to be acceptable, who could see effort and call it sufficient, who could witness competence and acknowledge it without demanding excellence, and that maybe, that possibility, it was radical, was revolutionary, was completely outside my experience of how people operated, how relationships worked, how approval was earned. That night after dinner of canned beans and venison jerky, I sat on floor near wood stove and asked question I'd been building toward since I arrived. Asked why do you live out here? And Silas was in his chair, always same chair, positioned where he could see both door and window without turning his head, and he held piece of wood in one hand and small knife in other, carving something I couldn't identify yet, and shavings fell into tin can between his boots, and he didn't answer. Immediately, the knife moved 3 more times, slow and precise, before he spoke, and he said because I stopped fitting anywhere else, and it wasn't full answer but it was honest fragment, and I recognized shape of it because I carried version of same truth inside myself. And I asked how long, and he said 11 years, maybe 12, stopped counting, and I asked don't you get lonely, and the knife paused, and he looked at me, really looked, not the measuring glance he'd been giving me since I arrived, but something closer to assessment, like he was deciding how much I could hold. And he said lonely is word for people who had company and lost it. I just got quiet, quiet's different. And then he went back to carving, and I understood that conversation had reached its edge for the night, and I pulled blanket around shoulders, put hand on belly where baby had started fluttering 2 weeks ago. Tiny movements like moth trapped under silk, and I watched fire until my eyes closed and over. Following days the quiet between us became language of its own. Silas wasn't teaching me exactly. He was just doing things in front of me, and I was smart enough to pay attention. I watched him check snare line for wire loops set along rabbit runs he'd identified by pattern of droppings and bent grass, and he showed me how wire needed to sit at specific height, for fingers above ground, angled so animal's own momentum would tighten loop, and he didn't explain the physics, just held up his hand for fingers spread and set the snare, and I did next one, and he adjusted angle by half-inch and walked on, and I watched him gut rabbit, swift, efficient, no wasted motion, blade open belly in single line. Organs came out in mass that he sorted with his fingers, liver and kidneys into tin bowl, intestines buried 6 inches deep downwind from cabin. And he washed his hands in creek water and dried them on his pants and never once looked like process bothered him or pleased him. It was just thing that needed doing, so he did it, and I watched him split firewood, and this was where I saw something in Silas that I hadn't expected. He positioned each log on stump with attention that bordered on tenderness, reading the grain the way someone else might read face, finding natural lines of fracture, places where wood wanted to come apart, and when axe fell it wasn't violent. It was collaboration between tool and material, and halves separated with clean, satisfying sound that echoed once against tree line and disappeared. And he said one afternoon, first unsolicited thing he'd said in 2 days, wood tells you where it wants to break. Force it where it doesn't want to go and you'll dull your blade and waste your energy. Listen to the material. And I thought about that for a long time, thought about how Dale had forced everything, had never listened, had never asked where things wanted to break, had just applied force until breaking happened on his terms, in his time, according to his will, and the destruction that came from that forcing, that refusal to listen to material, to person, to daughter, that destruction was complete, was total, was the reason I was here instead of there, was reason I'd chosen mountains over family, and understanding that, seeing that pattern, it made me realize that Silas's way, this listening, this attention to what material wanted, what would needed, what person required, this was opposite of everything I'd learned, was antithesis of Dale's philosophy, was proof that strength didn't require force, that power didn't require violence, that you could shape world without destroying it, and that shaping, that careful, attentive, collaborative shaping, it was what I wanted to learn, was what I needed to understand, was foundation of life I wanted to build for myself and baby, life where listening mattered, where material was respected, where force was last resort rather than first impulse. On 7th day I woke before Silas for first time. Fire was low, almost out, and I got up, fed it 3 pieces of kindling followed by split log the way I'd watched him do, put water on stove, and when he emerged from his room, curtained off section at back of cabin I'd never entered, fire was steady and water was close to boil, and he looked at fire, then at me, and something shifted behind his eyes, not warmth exactly, more like acknowledgement, recognition that I was no longer guest, was becoming part of structure, and he said there's coffee in blue tin, top shelf, and it wasn't invitation, it was inclusion, was way of saying you're not visitor anymore, you're person who lives here, you're person who maintains this place, you're part of this, and I felt it in my chest like first break of daylight, felt understanding that I'd passed some invisible threshold, that I'd moved from charity case to participant, from burden to contributor, and that movement, that shift, it mattered more than I could articulate because my entire life had been about being burden, being problem, being thing that people tolerated rather than wanted, and here in this cabin with this quiet man who spoke in fragments and carved wood and listened to material, I was becoming something else, was becoming person who could be relied on, who could contribute, who could maintain rather than deplete, and that becoming, that transformation, it was happening without me trying, without me performing, without me calculating how to be acceptable. It was just happening because I was doing things, was hauling water and feeding fire and learning snare lines, was participating in structure that required maintenance, and the maintenance, the work, the daily tasks, they were making me into someone I'd never been, someone competent, someone useful, someone who mattered not because of who she was, but because of what she did, and that mattering, that earned worth, it was different from anything I'd known, was solid where everything else had been conditional, was reliable where everything else had been transactional, was real in way that Dale's family, Charlene's love, the trailer I'd grown up in, none of those had ever been real, had all been performance, had all been contingent on my compliance, on my silence, on my willingness to be small, but here I could be size I actually was, could take up space I actually needed, could exist fully without apologizing, without shrinking, without calculating cost of visibility, and that existence, that full, honest, unperformed existence, it was teaching me things about myself I hadn't known, was showing me that I was stronger than I'd thought, more capable than I'd believed, more resilient than anyone including me had given me credit for, and that discovering, that understanding of my own capacity, it was foundation, was bedrock. was thing I'd build everything else on, was proof that Dale had been wrong, that Charlene had been wrong, that everyone who'd treated me as disposable had miscalculated, had failed to see that girl they were throwing away was actually girl who could survive anything, who could walk into mountains pregnant and alone, who could find strangers' cabin, who could earn place there, who could learn to haul water and set snares and split wood and feed fires, who could become person worth keeping not because someone decided to keep her, but because she decided to keep herself. And that decision, that fundamental choice to survive, to persist, to refuse to die quietly in wilderness or loudly in trailer, that decision was mine, was only thing that had ever been entirely mine, and I was going to honor it, was going to follow it wherever it led, was going to build life on foundation of that choice. And that life, that future, it was beginning here, was starting now, was being constructed one bucket of water, one split log, one morning fire at a time, and the construction, the building, it felt right, felt true, felt like first honest thing I'd done since walking out of that trailer, since choosing wilderness over violence, since deciding that maybe dying was better than definitely dying, and maybe, that precious fragile maybe, it was transforming into something more solid, into probably, into likely, into the understanding that I was going to make it, was going to survive, not just physically but emotionally, was going to emerge from this experience, not broken by it, but strengthened, not destroyed by abandonment but liberated by it, not crushed by violence but taught by it exactly what I didn't want to become, exactly what I refused to perpetuate, exactly what I was going to spend rest of my life ensuring my baby never experienced, never witnessed, never learned to accept as normal, and that ensuring, that protection, that commitment to being different, it was purpose, was meaning, was reason to keep going when going was hard, when cold crept in, when hunger gnawed, when loneliness pressed, when the weight of being 16 and pregnant and alone in wilderness with only strangers' kindness standing between me and death felt too heavy, felt unbearable, felt like more than any person should be expected to carry. I remembered that I was carrying it anyway, was bearing weight, was surviving, was building foundation for life where my baby would never have to choose between family and survival, would never have to calculate threat levels from people who claim to love them, would never have to walk into wilderness because wilderness was safer than home, and that never, that absolute commitment to different future, it gave me strength I didn't know I had, gave me resilience that surprised me, gave me capacity to endure things that should have broken me but instead just proved that I was unbreakable, or if not unbreakable then at least bend but don't break, at least capable of absorbing impact without shattering, at least strong enough to survive and surviving, that basic fundamental continuing to exist. It was victory, was triumph, was exactly what Dale and Charlene hadn't anticipated, hadn't planned for, hadn't believed I was capable of, and their miscalculation, their underestimation, it was going to cost them, was going to mean that girl they threw away became woman who proved them wrong, who demonstrated that unwanted children can thrive, that abandoned daughters can build lives, that people who society writes off can write their own stories, and my story, the story I was beginning to write here in this cabin with this quiet man and this growing baby, and this understanding that I was more than I'd been told. It was going to be good story, it was going to be survival story, it was going to be story about how girl with nothing became woman with everything, how loss became gain, how abandonment became liberation, how worst thing that ever happened became catalyst for best thing that could happen, and that transformation, that alchemy of turning trauma into strength, that was what I was doing here. That was what these days of hauling water and splitting wood were building toward, and I could feel it happening, could feel myself changing, could feel girl who'd walked up to this cabin 3 days ago fading and someone else, someone stronger, someone more certain, someone who knew her worth because she'd earned it rather than been granted it, emerging, and that emerging, that becoming, it was most important thing I'd ever done, was more significant than anything I'd achieve later because this was foundation. This was moment when I stopped being victim and started being survivor, when I stopped accepting what was done to me and started determining what I would do, when I stopped being passive recipient of other people's cruelty and became active agent of my own future, and that agency, that power to choose, that capacity to determine my own path, it was everything, was liberation, was the thing worth walking into mountains for, was the thing worth freezing and starving and risking death for. Because life without agency isn't life, is just existence, is just survival without purpose, without direction, without meaning, and I'd lived that way for 16 years, had existed without choosing, had survived without controlling, and I was done, was finished with that, was ready to live instead of just exist, to choose instead of just accept, to build instead of just endure, and the building was starting, was happening, was real, and Silas, this quiet man who barely spoke but saw everything, he was first person who'd ever given me space to build, who'd ever provided foundation without demanding payment, who'd ever offered help without strings attached, and that offering, that gift, it was going to save my life, was already saving it, was reason I was standing here instead of lying under rocks somewhere, was reason baby inside me was still alive, still growing, still preparing to enter a world that I was learning could be harsh but also could be kind, could be violent but also could be gentle, could be Dale and Charlene but also could be Silas, could be trailer full of cruelty, but also could be cabin full of quiet competence and basic human decency, and the understanding that sometimes the best thing you can give someone is distance and warmth and the space to figure out who they are without anyone telling them who they should be. The cabin, I came to understand over those early weeks, was more than shelter, it was life's work, was structure that Silas had built himself not all at once but over years, piece by piece the way person writes journal, adding rooms when he needed them, reinforcing walls as weather demanded, improving chimney draw, deepening root cellar, and the main room was oldest section, logs so darkened by time they were nearly black, and back room where I slept had been added later, logs lighter, joins tighter, evidence of man whose skills had grown along with his solitude, and below cabin accessed through trapdoor and kitchen floor was root cellar, and I'd seen Silas open it twice but hadn't gone down myself, had glimpsed stone walls, wooden shelves lined with jars, and deeper darkness beyond shelves that lantern light didn't quite reach. And one afternoon I asked what's down there, and Silas was cleaning rabbit he'd caught that morning, his hands moving with practiced efficiency, and he said story and closed trap door, and I understood that some questions would be answered when I was ready, when he decided, when time was right, and rushing, demanding, pushing for information before it was offered. That was Dale's way. That was violence disguised as curiosity, and I was learning different way, was learning that patience was form of respect. That waiting was acknowledgement that people had right to control their own narratives, their own timing, their own revelations, and that acknowledgement, that respect for boundaries, it was something I'd never experienced, had never been granted, had spent 16 years having every boundary violated, every privacy invaded, every personal space claimed by people who believed that being family gave them unlimited access, unlimited authority, unlimited right to know everything, control everything, determine everything, and Silas's boundaries, his clear demarcations between what he'd share and what he'd keep, they were teaching me that I could have boundaries too, that I could say not yet, could say not now, could say that's mine and have that ownership respected, and that teaching, that modeling of healthy boundaries, it was revolutionary, was completely outside my experience, was proof that there were ways to be human that didn't involve constant invasion, constant surveillance, constant requirement that you justify your existence, your choices, your right to privacy. On the 14th day, which was early November by my counting, Silas did something out of routine. After dinner, instead of picking up his carving, he reached a bookshelf and pulled down leather-bound journal, thick, well-worn, and he held it for a moment, his thumb running along spine. And then he set it on table between us. And he said this was his, the man who taught me, his name was Harlan Voss. And I looked at journal but didn't touch it. Understood that touching required permission. And Silas continued, said he built this cabin before me or started it. I finished what he couldn't. He owned this land, not on paper. County doesn't know about this parcel. It sits in gap between two survey boundaries, ghost land. Doesn't exist on any map that matters. And I asked, how is that possible? And Silas said, because Harlan made sure of it. He was a careful man, knew how to keep things hidden. And he pushed journal inch closer to me, said, I want you to read this, not tonight, when you're ready. There are things in there about why this cabin exists, about what's under it, about people who might come looking one day. And his voice had changed, not louder, not agitated, but there was gravity in it now. Weight of something carried long time and carefully set down. And I asked, why are you telling me this? And Silas looked at me, and for first time I saw something behind his eyes that I recognized, not from his face but from mirrors, the look of someone who'd been holding something alone for too long. And he said, because I'm 68 years old, and I've been coughing blood for 3 weeks, and somebody needs to know. And the fire cracked, Log shifted in stove, sending small shower of sparks against iron door. And outside rain continued its patient drumming on roof, and I stared at him, said coughing blood, repeated it, made it real by speaking it, and he said started last month, getting worse. And he said it the way he said everything, factual, unadorned, stripped of self. Pity, and I said you need to see someone, there must be town clinic, and he said no, one word, quiet but final, said I've been on this mountain for 12 years because world down there has nothing I want and people I can't afford to be found by. That hasn't changed. And then he said my name, said Nola, and it stilled me not because it was sharp but because it was first time he'd used it with any weight. Said I didn't tell you so you'd fix it, I told you because things Harlan left here, things under this cabin, they need keeper, and you're only person who's walked through that door in 11 years, I think, and the silence that followed was different from our usual silences. This one had edges, and I said I don't understand, you don't know me, I'm 16, I'm pregnant, I have nothing. And Silas said you showed up at my door half dead, and first thing you did, when you woke up was warn me you were pregnant, not ask for help. Warn me, like you were giving me permission to turn you away before you got comfortable. He paused, said that tells me everything I need to know about who you are, and he stood slowly, and I noticed for first time the care with which he moved, slight hitch in breathing, way he braced one hand on table as he rose, signs I should have seen earlier, signs I would have seen if I hadn't been so consumed with my own survival, and he said read the journal, and tomorrow, I'll show you the cellar, the real one. Not the one with canned beans, and he disappeared behind his curtain, and I was left alone with fire and leather-bound journal and sound of rain on roof and feeling of world shifting beneath my feet like mountain itself had taken breath. I need to stop here because I need you to understand something critical, something that's going to matter for everything that comes next. Type inherited if you've ever received something from family member you never met. Type secrets if you know what it's like to discover that your past is more complicated than anyone told you, because what I was about to learn, what was written in that journal, it wasn't just Harlan Voss's story. It was mine, was my grandfather's story, was explanation for things I'd never understood about my father, about why he left, about where I came from, about bloodline that connected me to this mountain in ways I couldn't have imagined. And from our stats, we've got way more viewers than subscribers. If you're following this story, if you need to know what's in that journal, if you're dealing with your own family secrets and need to see how mine unfolded, kindly join our community and subscribe, because what happens next, what I discovered in those pages, it changed everything I thought I knew about my life, my family, my right to be here, and that discovery, that revelation, it's coming, and you need to see it. I opened journal that night, couldn't wait, couldn't sleep, couldn't do anything except read, and Harlan Voss's handwriting was small and exact, letters formed with discipline of someone who'd been taught that penmanship mattered, and first page held only single line. For whoever comes next, the mountain keeps what the world forgets, protect it, and I turned page and story began with dates from 1981, began with man named Harlan who worked for a company called Ridgewell Resources who surveyed land looking for minerals, who was good at his job, very good, methodical, precise, someone who documented everything, who believed evidence was sacred, and in spring of 1983 working alone in southern Cascades he'd struck something, had found deposit of rare earth elements, significant deposit, one of largest in Pacific Northwest, and he'd followed protocol, had submitted core samples, had filed survey data, had recommended further assessment, and company had responded not with excitement but with silence, with meeting in Portland where a man named Clifton Ridgewell had asked single question, who else has seen this? And Harlan had said no one, and Clifton had nodded and said company would handle it internally, and Harlan had left that meeting with feeling he couldn't immediately identify, and by time he reached his car he'd named it. It was feeling of having shown someone something valuable and watching them decide to steal it, and that feeling, that recognition it had been correct, because company had terminated him within month, had presented him with non-disclosure agreement, had threatened litigation if he ever discussed geological data, had buried his findings, had claimed land was worthless while knowing it was worth millions, maybe hundreds of millions, and Harlan, he'd made copies before they could stop him, had documented everything, had kept evidence because he'd read the weather, had trusted his instincts over their words, and then he'd found the survey gap, the parcel that existed physically but not administratively, and he'd built cabin here, had established habitation, had planned to claim land through adverse possession, 12 years of continuous occupation, and it would be his. except his body had betrayed him, had developed cancer that doctors said was inoperable, 6 months, maybe less, and he'd spent those months building vault under cabin, sealing evidence, preserving documentation, writing in this journal, and on-page dated. September 1992, 9 years into his occupation, he'd written something that made my hands shake, made my breath stop, made world tilt. He'd written, I cannot complete the 12 years. Diagnosis is confirmed, but I have son, Thomas, son I never raised, son Ruth kept from me, son who married woman named Charlene, son who had daughter, Nola, and I've been watching from distance, checking county records, unable to let go. And the girl, my granddaughter, she's in system now, Charlene remarried. Records suggest it's not good situation. I can't help her directly, I'm dying. Any contact would create paper trail that Ridgewell could follow. But I can leave this. All of it. The land, the evidence, the vault. If she finds her way here, she'll have everything I couldn't give her in life. And I read that. Read my own name in dead grandfather's handwriting. Read that man I'd never met had been watching, had been caring, had been building something for me, had known about Dale, had suspected. About Charlene. Had left inheritance not of money, but of justice, of weapon against people who'd stolen from him, of land that was mine by blood, by right, by grandfather's intention, and I understood then, understood why Silas had given me the journal, understood why he'd said somebody needs to know, understood that I hadn't stumbled onto this cabin randomly, hadn't found it by accident, had been drawn here by something deeper than desperation, by bloodline, by inheritance, by grandfathers. Love expressed not through presence but through preparation, through building something that would wait for me, that would be here when I needed it, that would prove I wasn't unwanted, wasn't disposable, was a mistake, was actually heir, was actually valuable, was actually person worth protecting even from grave, even across years, even through death, and that protection, that delayed but real love, it was more than Dale had ever given, more than Charlene had ever shown, was proof that family could mean something other than violence, something other than abandonment, could mean legacy, could mean preparation, could mean loving someone enough to build them foundation, even knowing you'd never see them use it. And Harlan, my grandfather Harlan Voss, he'd loved me that way, had loved me enough to spend dying months creating shelter for granddaughter he'd never held, had loved me enough to document everything, to preserve evidence, to build case that would still be viable decades later, to ensure that if I survived, if I made it here, if I found this place, I'd have weapon, have resources, have proof that I mattered, that I was worth something, that somewhere in tangled broken chain of fathers and daughters and leaving and staying there had been love, and that love, that proof of worth, it was changing me, was healing something I hadn't known was broken, was filling space I hadn't known was empty, was teaching me that being unwanted by Dale and Charlene didn't mean being unwanted by everyone, didn't mean being worthless, didn't mean being mistake, meant only that they were limited, were small, were incapable of seeing value in front of them, but Harlan, he'd seen it, had known it, had believed in it enough to build entire future around possibility that someday his granddaughter might need exactly what he was leaving, and that belief, that faith in person he'd never met, it was most powerful thing anyone had ever given me, was foundation more solid than cabin, more valuable than land, more important than evidence sealed in vault below, because it was proof that I was loved, that I mattered, that I was worth protecting, and knowing that, understanding that, it changed everything, changed how I saw myself, changed how I saw my past, changed how I imagined my future, because I wasn't just girl who'd run from violence, I was granddaughter of man who'd fought injustice. I wasn't just pregnant teenager with nowhere to go. I was heir to land that existed in gap between maps. I wasn't just survivor. I was keeper of secrets, protector of evidence, continuation of fight that grandfather had started and Silas had maintained, and now it was mine, was my responsibility, my inheritance, my purpose, and that purpose, that understanding of why I was here, why I'd found this cabin, why Silas had let me stay, it was larger than survival, was about justice, was about fighting company that had stolen from my grandfather, was about claiming what was rightfully mine, was about proving that you can throw girl away, but you can't erase her, can't eliminate her claim, can't deny her right to inheritance, to justice, to revenge against people who thought they could bury evidence, silent surveyor, steal fortune, and face no consequences, except consequences were coming, were inevitable, were waiting in vault below cabin where grandfather's documentation sat preserved, where proof of fraud was sealed, where case against Ridgewell Resources was ready to be filed, and filing it. That was going to be my job, my task, my way of honoring grandfather I'd never known, of proving that his faith in me wasn't misplaced, of demonstrating that girl he'd loved from distance was strong enough, smart enough, stubborn enough to finish fight he'd started. And that fight, that beautiful, terrible, necessary fight, it was about to begin. The next morning Silas showed me the vault, and I used that word deliberately because what was beneath the cabin wasn't just cellar, wasn't just storage space, was engineered structure, was testament to my grandfather's understanding that evidence meant nothing if it couldn't be preserved, if moisture destroyed it, if time degraded it, if people who wanted it buried could find it and finish what they'd started. And Silas opened trap door and kitchen floor, descended ladder carefully, his breathing labored in a way that made my chest tighten, and I followed, my pregnant belly making narrow ladder awkward, making descent slower, more careful, and at bottom was what I'd seen before, root cellar with stone walls, shelves of canned goods, smell of damp earth and cold air. But Silas didn't stop there. Moved to far wall, pressed hand flat against section of stone that looked identical to every other section, and something clicked. Mechanism hidden in wall, mechanical, not electronic. Designed to work without power in place that had none, and section of stone wall swung inward revealing passage barely wide enough for one person, cut into bedrock of mountain itself. And Silas said Harlan was engineer. He didn't just think about what to hide. He thought about how to hide it so it would last, and passage extended maybe 15 feet, sloping slightly downward. Walls rough-hewn but stable, and at end was door. Not cabin door, vault door, steel set into concrete frame with combination lock that Silas worked with fingers that knew sequence by heart, and door opened, and inside was room size of large closet carved from solid rock, and air was cool and dry, perfectly still, sealed from moisture and temperature swings that destroyed paper and corroded metal over decades, and shelves lined 3 walls. And on those shelves arranged with meticulous organization of man who believed evidence was everything were contents of Harlan Voss's life's work, geological surveys. Bound in protective plastic labeled by date and location, core sample photographs, mineral assay results from 3 independent laboratories, internal memoranda from Ridgewell Resources, some bearing Clifton Ridgewell's signature documenting company's knowledge of rare earth deposits and their deliberate decision to suppress findings, legal analyses of adverse possession statutes, correspondence with county assessor's office showing Ridgewell's fraudulent claim that parcel was mineral barren, and on bottom shelf in fireproof lockbox was cash, and I counted it later, just over $43,000 in bundled bills, old but intact, preserved by vault's climate-controlled conditions, and I whispered 43,000, and Silas said Harlan sold everything he had in years before he died, car, house in Medford, equipment, savings, converted it all to cash and sealed it down here. Said paper money doesn't leave electronic trails. This is enough to hire lawyer. That's what it's for. And, he continued, said the surveys alone, if presented in court with Ridgewell correspondence, would prove fraud on scale that could cost them hundreds of millions. The rare earth deposit at current market value. I can't even estimate. Harlan couldn't either, and he was expert. And I looked around vault. Looked at evidence of man I'd never met who'd spent dying years building weapon against people who'd stolen from him. Not weapon of anger, but weapon of precision. Every document dated, every claim supported, every piece of evidence preserved with care of someone who knew that truth properly documented was more powerful than any lie, no matter how expensive the liar. And I said he built all of this knowing he'd never use it himself. And Silas said that's what made him different from them. Ridgewell thinks in quarters, Harlan thought in generations, and we stood in vault, lantern casting long shadows across shelved evidence. And I felt full architecture of my inheritance settle onto shoulders, not just money, not just land, but responsibility, fight that had been waiting 30 years for someone to pick it up. And Silas said, as if reading my thoughts, Ridgewell is still operating, bigger now than when Harlan worked for them. They've been acquiring mineral rights across Pacific Northwest for years, but they've never come back here. Survey gap protected us. They don't know exactly where deposit is because Harlan's original coordinates were in files they buried, and without those files they're guessing, but they're still looking. They send survey teams through this region every few years, helicopters sometimes. Never found cabin, canopy is too thick, and we don't show up on satellite because we don't exist on any map, but they haven't stopped looking. Whatever Harlan found, they know it's here somewhere. They just can't prove where until someone tells them. And he looked at me, said until someone tells them, or until their technology gets good enough to find it without being told. Could be next year, could be 10 years, but it's coming. And I understood that inheritance wasn't just passive receipt, was active responsibility, was preparation for battle that was inevitable, was arming myself for fight that would come whether I wanted it or not. And I asked what happens when they come, and Silas moved even more slowly than before, climbing back up ladder, stopping twice to catch breath in a way that made my chest hurt, and we sealed trapdoor behind us. And he sat in his chair with effort costing him more than he wanted to show, and he said they'll come with lawyers and documents and men in clean boots who've never split piece of firewood in their lives. They'll tell you this land is theirs. They'll offer you money to leave. And when you refuse, they'll threaten you. And then you show them what's involved and you watch their faces change. He picked up carving knife and piece of wood he'd been shaping for days. And I could see it now. Small figure. Rough but recognizable. Bird with wings half spread as if caught in moment between stillness and flight. And he said, Harlan told me something before he died, said the mountain doesn't care who wins. It just keeps what it's given and waits for someone brave enough to come claim it. And he held up Bird, turning it in lantern light, then set it on table and slid it toward me, said he'd have liked you. You're stubborn same way he was, good kind of stubborn, kind that builds things. And I picked up small wooden Bird and held it in palm. It was warm from Silas's hands. Wings were delicate, carved thin. Enough that lantern light passed through edges, and head was tilted slightly as if Bird was listening to something only it could hear, and I closed fingers around it carefully, held it against chest where baby was pressing outward with slow, steady insistence that felt less like kicking now and more like knocking, like asking to come in, and I said, I'm not leaving this mountain, and Silas nodded, and for first time since I'd known him the lines around his mouth didn't just soften, they arranged themselves into something unmistakable, smile. Brief, quiet, gone almost before it arrived, but real. And he said, I know. That's why I showed you. December arrived with snow that buried the clearing, that reached porch railing, that made every morning journey to creek an expedition, that deepened until world became white silence broken only by wind through pines and crack of trees splitting in cold. And Silas got worse, got so much worse. The coughing that had brought blood in specks became coughing that brought blood in mouthfuls, and he stopped checking snare line, stopped splitting wood, stopped going further than porch, where he'd sit, wrapped in blanket watching tree line with those still water eyes like man counting things he'd miss, and I took over everything, took over fire before sunrise, took over water from creek, took over snare line which I now set and checked with 4-finger spacing he'd taught me, took over cooking and cleaning and splitting wood which I did badly at first, and then less badly, listening to grain the way he'd told me, letting axe fine line would wanted to follow, and my body protested. 7 months. Pregnant now, center of gravity shifting daily, lower back aching in ways that woke me at night, but I did it, did every task, every morning, every requirement, not because anyone demanded it but because structure required maintenance, and I was structure now, was keeper, was person responsible for keeping cabin warm, keeping food available, keeping life possible in place where winter tried very hard to make life impossible, and I learned things that December, learned that hunger in deep winter is different from hunger in autumn, not gnawing but hollowing, slow evacuation of energy that makes thoughts thick and movements careful. Learn that cold, when it's deep enough, stops being sensation and becomes fact, becomes thing you are rather than thing you feel. Learned that I was stronger than I'd believed, more capable than anyone had given me credit for, more determined than circumstances should have allowed, and that strength, that capability, that determination, it was coming from somewhere deep, from place I hadn't known existed, from core of self that had survived Dale's boots and Charlene's abandonment and 3 days in wilderness, and now was surviving winter that was trying to kill me, was trying to freeze me, was trying to starve me. Except I refused to die, refused to let baby die, refused to let Silas's faith in me, Harlan's preparation for me, the mountain's protection of me, to be wasted, to be for nothing, to end with my frozen body found in spring by people who'd say she tried, she almost made it, wasn't quite strong enough because I was strong enough, was exactly strong enough, was discovering that strength isn't something you have, is something you become, is something that builds through resistance, through difficulty, through moments when giving up would be easier than continuing, and continuing anyway, continuing despite pain, despite fear, despite rational calculation that says this is too much, this is impossible, this is more than one person can bear, and bearing it anyway, that's where strength comes from. That's how you discover what you're capable of, and I was discovering I was capable of everything, of maintaining cabin alone, of keeping fire burning, of hauling water through snow, of setting snares, of splitting wood at 7 months pregnant, of watching Silas deteriorate knowing he was dying, knowing he'd saved my life, knowing I couldn't save his, and that knowledge, that understanding that some people can be saved and some can't, that sometimes the best you can do as witness is be present, is make comfortable. That was hardest lesson, was most adult understanding I'd achieved, was recognition that love sometimes means letting go, means accepting, means sitting beside someone while they prepare to leave, and not demanding they stay, not insisting they fight, not making their death about your need, and Silas was preparing to leave, was organizing things, was showing me where tools were kept, was explaining which herbs were medicinal, was transferring knowledge with urgency of someone who knows time is short, and one night in mid-December, he called me over, his voice weak but clear, and he said the bird I carved, give it to your baby when she's old enough. Tell her it came from man who believed she was worth protecting before she was born, and I said you think it's girl, and he said I know it's girl, can tell by how you carry, and I said how do you know these things, and he smiled. Said Harlan taught me, he knew everything about mountains, about living, about what matters, and what matters, Nola, is that you understand this cabin, this land, this fight, it's not burden, is gift, is opportunity to prove that people who steal, who lie, who hurt, they don't win, they face consequences, and your consequence, your justice, you're exactly what they should fear, and he coughed, long rattling cough that brought blood, and I held cloth to his mouth, and when coughing subsided he said, promise me you'll fight. Promise me you won't let them take this, and I promised, said I swear I'll fight. I'll use everything Harlan left, I'll make them pay, and he nodded, said good, that's good, and he closed his eyes, and 2 days later on Thursday in late December, on morning when I brought him coffee, and he didn't take it, when his hand rested on journal, and his eyes pointed at window but tracked nothing, I knew before I touched him, knew the way you know fire has gone out before you see cold hearth, and I touched his hand anyway, cool. Not cold yet but cooling, warmth leaving him gradually from edges inward, and I said his name, said Silas, and nothing, and I sat on floor beside his chair the way I'd sat so many evenings, and I put my hand on his knee and I breathed, and baby turned inside me, slow roll, and fire crackled, and outside snow fell with patience of something that had nowhere else to be, and I understood that I was alone now, was completely alone, was 16 years old, 7 months. Pregnant, living in cabin that didn't exist with responsibility to fight corporation, with inheritance that required protecting, with baby coming in 2 months, and only person who knew I was alive was now dead, was gone, was under cairn of creek stones I'd built east of cabin in clearing where morning light came through cedars, and I should have been terrified, should have been panicking, should have been unable to function. But instead I fed fire, I boiled water, I walked to snare line. Because rabbits didn't know someone had died and neither did my hunger, and I survived that day and next, and surviving, that basic fundamental continuing to exist, it was victory, was exactly what I'd promised Silas I'd do, was honoring him by refusing to quit, by maintaining structure he'd maintained, by keeping cabin warm, by preparing for baby, by reading Harlan's journal again, by memorizing evidence, by planning for day when Ridgewell would come, by becoming keeper, not just of land but of legacy, of fight, of justice that had waited 30 years and could wait 2 more months until baby was born, until I was strong enough, until I was ready to walk down mountain and find lawyer, and begin process of destroying people who thought they could steal fortune, bury evidence, silence witnesses, and face no consequences, because consequences were coming, were inevitable, were angry pregnant teenage granddaughter of man they'd wronged, and that granddaughter, that keeper, that fighter, she was just getting started. The baby came on February 2nd in late afternoon when light was failing and snow was falling and I was completely alone, and it started before dawn with tightening across my belly that woke me from shallow sleep. Not pain yet but pressure like mountain itself was leaning on me, and I lay still and counted time between contractions by watching fire shadows move across ceiling, irregular at first, then closer, then closer. And, by mid-morning, pain had become something I couldn't think around it. Occupied me completely, each contraction a wave that built from lower back and crested through entire body, leaving me breathless and shaking in troughs between. And I'd prepared, had boiled water and stored it in clean jars, had torn cleanest fabric into strips for bandages, had reread chapter on birth in medical reference book I'd found on Silas's shelf 3 times, memorizing stages, signs of complication, simple interventions available without technology, and I'd laid out Silas's medicine. Cash beside cot where I planned to deliver, iodine, bandages, knife I'd sterilized in fire, and I talked to baby, had said, here's the plan, you come out, you breathe, I cut cord, we figure out everything else after, sound good? And baby had kicked hard enough to make me wince, and I'd said I'll take that as yes. And now it was happening, was real, was labor that had moved from manageable to overwhelming, from pressure to pain that rewrote everything I thought I knew about what body could endure. And I moved to cot, had water within reach, had strips of clean fabric, had iodine, had knife, had plant guide open to page on pain management, though there was nothing mild about this, nothing manageable. This was body opening itself in most fundamental way body can open, and no amount of preparation, no amount of reading, no amount of mental rehearsal could prepare you for reality of pushing life out of yourself, of feeling bones shift, of understanding that this was ancient, was primal, was thing women had been doing since beginning of human existence, and some survived and some didn't. And I was going to survive because I'd promised Silas, had promised Harlan, had promised myself and baby that we'd make it, that we'd both come through this, that we'd emerge on other side alive and together and ready to fight whatever came next. And I gripped frame of cot and bore down when body told me to bear down, and I breathed when body let me breathe, and I made sounds I'd never made before, low animal sounds that came from place beneath language, beneath thought, from part of person that is simply and entirely alive. And it took 9 hours, 9 hours of contractions that felt like dying, of pain that felt endless, of pushing that felt impossible. And at some point I stopped being aware of cabin, of fire, of cold, of mountain. I existed only in rhythm of contractions and rests between, in expanding pressure and overwhelming need to push. My world shrank to size of my own body and body inside it. 2 lives negotiating border between one existence and 2, and then in last light of winter afternoon with fire burning low and shadows long across floor baby came, and I caught her myself, slippery, impossibly warm, smaller than I'd imagined and louder than I'd expected, and cry-filled cabin the way my own cry of grief had filled it when Silas died, completely, reaching every corner, bouncing off beams and stone hearth and shelf of books and jars of herbs, and I cut cord with sterilized knife, tied it with strip of clean fabric, and held my daughter against chest, and her skin was flushed and wrinkled, her fists clenched, her mouth open in continued protest against cold, bright world she'd been pushed into, and I said, I know it's a lot, but you're here now, and I cleaned her as gently as I could with warm water from jars I'd prepared, and I wrapped her in softest thing I had, flannel shirt Silas had given me, one I'd worn every day for weeks, one that still smelled faintly of wood smoke and cedar, and quiet man who'd handed it to me without explanation. And baby stopped crying, lay against chest, small body rising and falling with each breath, eyes barely open, seeing nothing and everything. And I leaned back against wall and held her, and outside snow fell, and fire crackled, and cabin that Harlan had started and Silas had finished, and I now kept stood solid around us like pair of cupped hands, and I named her Rose, not after anyone specific, but after thing itself, after something that grows where it's planted, that opens in its own time, that is thorns because world requires them, and beauty because world deserves it, and Rose nursed within first hour, latching with instinct that amazed me. Baby knew what to do, mother's body knew what to provide. Between us we figured it out awkwardly, imperfectly, with lot of adjusting and repositioning and quiet frustration, but we figured it out. And over next 3 weeks I learned that caring for newborn in mountain cabin without electricity, running water, or another human being was both simpler and harder than I'd imagined. Simpler because baby needed only 3 things, warmth, food, and closeness. Harder because providing those 3 things while also maintaining fire, Hauling water through deep snow, checking snares, keeping myself fed, required level of constant grinding effort that left me so exhausted I sometimes fell asleep standing up. But Rose was healthy. She gained weight. Her cry grew stronger. Her eyes that had been unfocused dark blue of all newborns began to clarify into something lighter, gray maybe like Silas's or pale blue that Harlan's might have been, and I talked to her constantly. Not baby talk but real talk, same way I talked to Silas. Sentences that assumed listener was intelligent and paying attention. Said, "That's wood stove. It keeps us alive. You have to respect it, but you don't have to fear it. Same goes for most things." Said, "This is your great-grandfather's journal. He was careful man. He built case that could bring down company, and he hid it in mountain, and he left it for us. When you're older, you'll read it yourself." Said, "That smell is venison broth. You'll graduate to it eventually, for now original recipe is better." And I glanced down at my own chest, no offense taken, and February slid into March. Snow began to melt not all at once, but in increments, eaves dripping first, then patches of dark earth appearing and clearing, then creeks swelling with runoff, its voice returning after months of muffled silence, and world was waking up and I woke with it. Began planning in earnest, not just surviving but planning. Vault was still sealed beneath cabin. Evidence was intact, $43,000 in cash. Geological surveys documenting one of largest rare earth deposits in Pacific Northwest, internal Ridgewell correspondence proving fraud, chain of continuous habitation spanning over 20 years, and I needed lawyer, someone who understood mineral rights, adverse possession, corporate fraud, someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated by company with Ridgewell's resources, and I also needed to leave mountain for first time in 5 months, needed to do it with newborn. And in mid-March, when logging road had cleared enough to be passable on foot, I packed bag. Diapers I'd sewn from old fabric, last of dried jerky, water, leather journal, and from Vault 1 geological survey, original one with Harlan's signature and coordinates that Ridgewell had buried, and I left rest sealed below because I wasn't stupid enough to carry everything I had into uncertain territory. And I wrapped Rose against chest with length of fabric tied across shoulders the way I'd seen women carry babies in photographs, and baby settled against heartbeat and slept, and walked too. Prospect took most of day, my body still recovering from birth, muscles weak from winter, and I stopped frequently to rest and feed Rose. But trail I'd stumbled up 5 months ago in desperation was familiar now. I knew where steep banks were, knew where creek crossings were safest, knew this forest the way I knew cabin, not as stranger passing through, but as someone who lived here and would return. And Prospect was exactly as small and quiet as I remembered, and I walked to diner because it was only place I knew, because woman named Rosie had been kind that first time, and kindness was currency I'd learned to value above all others, and bell above door jangled when I pushed it open, and Rosie looked up from behind counter, and her expression went through 3 changes in rapid succession, surprise, confusion, and then something that might have been wonder, and she said, "Good Lord, you're the girl from October," and I said, "I am," and her eyes dropped to bundle against chest, and Rose was awake now, blinking at fluorescent lights with startled concentration of someone seeing artificial light for first time, and Rosie said, "And who is this?" And I said, "This is Rose. She's 6 weeks old. She was born in cabin on mountain, and she's reason I need to find lawyer." And Rosie stared at me for a long moment, then did what she'd done first time, poured cup of coffee, set it on counter, said, "Sit down, tell me everything." And I sat, and I drank coffee, and I told her enough, not everything, not vault or rare earth deposits, but enough, the cabin, the land claim, the old man who died, the company that would come, and Rosie said without hesitation, "You need Alice Whitfield. She's in Medford. Used to be with big firm in Portland. Environmental law, land rights, that sort of thing. Moved down here 5 years ago after husband passed. She's sharp as tack, and she doesn't scare easy." And I asked, "Can she be trusted?" And Rosie looked at me, said, "Honey, I've known Alice Whitfield for 20 years. She turned down partnership at one of biggest firms in Oregon because they wanted her to represent logging company against tribal land claim. She walked away from more money than you or I will ever see because it wasn't right." She paused. "Yes, she can be trusted." And Rosie drove me to Medford herself. Insisted that girl with 6-week-old baby wasn't taking bus anywhere. And Alice Whitfield's office was on 2nd floor of brick building in downtown Medford, accessible by narrow staircase, with handrail worn smooth by decades of gripping hands, And Alice was in her early 60s with short silver hair, reading glasses on chain around neck, and eyes that missed nothing, and she listened to my story without interruption for 40 minutes, and when I finished, Alice removed glasses, set them on desk, was quiet for long time, and she said, "You have original survey, Harlan's signature, and coordinates," and I slid it across desk, and Alice examined it the way Silas had examined piece of wood, reading details, finding structure beneath surface, and she said, "And rest of documentation, Ridgewell correspondence, mineral assays, evidence of fraud, it's all in vault, sealed and preserved," and I said, "I can take you there," and Alice said, "Not yet," set survey down carefully, said, "If what you've described is accurate, we're looking at adverse possession claim with over 20 years continuous habitation backed by evidence of corporate fraud involving suppression of geological data worth potentially hundreds of millions. Ridgewell's legal team will fight this with everything they have," and I said, "I know," and she said, "They'll challenge your standing, they'll challenge Harlan's chain of possession, they'll challenge validity of adverse possession on unsurveyed land, they'll dig into your background and use your age and circumstances against you," and I said, "I know," and Alice studied me the way Silas had studied me on first night, measuring, deciding, and she said, "How old are you?" "Exactly," and I said, 17 next month, and she said, "And the baby?" and I said, 6 weeks, and she said, "No family support, no resources beyond what's in vault," and I said, "No," and she said, "And you walked down mountain with newborn to find me," and I said, "I did," and Alice put glasses back on, took legal pad from desk drawer, picked up pen, and she said, "Tell me again, from beginning, and this time don't leave anything out," and I told her everything, told her about Dale's boots and Charlene's choice, told her about 3 days in wilderness, told her about Silas and Harlan and journal and vault and evidence and dying alone with baby and walking down mountain because I'd promised to fight, because I'd inherited not just land but responsibility, because somewhere in my bloodline was man who'd been wronged and had spent dying years preparing weapon for granddaughter he'd never meet, and that weapon, that beautiful, terrible, necessary weapon, I was ready to use it, was ready to destroy company that thought they could steal fortune and face no consequences, and Alice listened, took notes, asked questions, verified details, and when I finished she looked at me with expression I couldn't quite read, and she said, "I'm going to take your case, not because it's lucrative, though it will be, not because it's high profile, though it will be, but because in 35 years of practice I've never seen evidence this comprehensive, fraud this documented, or client this determined, and determination, real determination, that's what wins cases. That's what defeats corporations. That's what makes David beat Goliath. And Unola Price, our most determined person I've ever met. And we're going to destroy them. We're going to use every document Harlan preserved, every year Silas maintained, every day you've survived. And we're going to prove that land is yours, that fraud was real, that consequences are inevitable. And when we're done, Ridgewell Resources will wish they'd never heard Harlan Voss's name, will wish they'd paid him fairly, will wish they'd done right thing, because doing wrong thing, stealing from careful man who documented everything, that was biggest mistake they ever made, and that mistake is going to cost them everything, is going to cost them hundreds of millions, is going to cost them reputation, is going to cost them credibility, and I'm going to make absolutely certain of it. And I sat there holding Rose, holding daughter, who'd been born in cabin her great-grandfather built, who was heir to fortune her great-grandfather found, who is proof that unwanted children can thrive, that abandoned daughters can claim inheritances, that girls with nothing can become women with everything, and I understood that fight was beginning, was starting now, was launching with Alice's commitment, with evidence in vault, with chain of habitation, with determination that had carried me through Dale's violence and Charlene's abandonment and wilderness and winter and birth and death, and everything that should have broken me, but instead had just proven I was unbreakable, and that unbreakable girl, that determined woman, that fierce mother, that keeper of grandfather's legacy, she was ready, was absolutely ready, to fight, to win, to prove that justice delayed isn't justice denied, is sometimes justice perfected, justice documented, justice that arrives exactly when it should with exactly the force it requires. And that force was coming, was inevitable, was me and Alice and evidence and law and righteous anger and generational determination, and Ridgewell Resources had no idea, had no warning, had no preparation for storm that was building, for consequences that were coming, for a girl who'd survived everything they couldn't imagine and was about to show them exactly what survival created, exactly what it cost to wrong careful man, to bury evidence, to steal fortune, to think you could escape justice just because you had money, had power, had decades of getting away with fraud because decades of getting away with it just meant decades of evidence accumulating, decades of documentation building, decades of case strengthening, and that case, that beautiful, devastating, comprehensive case, it was ready, was waiting, was about to be filed, and filing it, that was going to change everything. The legal process moved with speed that surprised me and apparently surprised Alice as well, and adverse possession claim was filed in county court within 2 weeks, and Alice, after visiting Vault and spending 3 hours photographing every document with meticulous care, described evidence as most comprehensive case of documented corporate fraud I've seen in 35 years of practice. And Ridgewell correspondence alone was devastating. Internal memos showed that Clifton Ridgewell had personally ordered suppression of Harlan's survey data. Subsequent communications revealed that company had filed fraudulent claims with county assessor's office, deliberately misrepresenting parcel as mineral barren to prevent competing claims, and fraud was systematic, documented, signed by executives whose names still appeared on company's current leadership page. And Alice filed adverse possession claim and fraud complaint simultaneously, same day, same courthouse, called it legal pincer. Movement said adverse possession established my right to land. Fraud complaint established Ridgewell's wrongdoing. Together they created situation where company couldn't challenge one without exposing themselves to other, and Ridgewell's response came within week. Not from lawyers but from trucks, and I was back at cabin when I heard them, that mechanical growl that didn't belong to Forrest, grinding up logging road on morning in early April, when snow was gone from clearing and first green. Chutes were pushing through mud, 2 trucks, new, clean, with Ridgewell logos on doors for men, 3 in company jackets, 1 in overcoat and dress shoes that were immediately absurdly wrong for mountain, and man in overcoat approached porch where I stood with Rose held against shoulder, and he carried leather folder, and he smiled the way people smile when they want you to feel outranked, said Miss Price, Russell Kendrick, Ridgewell Resources. We'd like to discuss terms, and I said I know who you are, and I know what you'd like to discuss. My lawyer has already filed in county court. If Ridgewell wants to talk, they can contact Alice Whitfield's office in Medford. And Kendrick's smile thinned. Said Miss Price, we're prepared to offer generous compensation for voluntary relocation. And D.I. said the answer is no. And he said you haven't heard the number. And I said the number doesn't matter. This land has been continuously occupied for over 20 years. Adverse possession claim is filed, documented, supported by evidence your legal team hasn't seen yet. I paused. But they will, and one of jacketed men shifted his weight, and Kendrick glanced at his folder then back at me, and I could see him recalculating, adjusting story he'd arrived with, the one where teenage girl with baby on broken porch would crumble under weight of corporation's attention, and he said you're making mistake. And professional warmth was gone. Underneath was same thing that was always underneath men. Like this, certainty that power entitled them to whatever they wanted, and I said maybe, but it's my mistake to make on my land, and Rose chose that moment to cry, not distressed cry but hungry cry, insistent and loud, filling clearing with sound that had no regard for corporate leverage or real estate law, and I looked at Kendrick, said we're done, and I turned and walked inside, closed door, latched it, sat in Silas's chair, and nursed my daughter, while sound of truck engines faded down mountain and forest swallowed silence back, and I understood that first skirmish was over, that they'd tested me, had tried intimidation, had assumed youth and circumstances made me vulnerable, and they'd learned they were wrong, had discovered that girl they thought they could buy or scare was actually heir to land, keeper of evidence, continuation of fight they'd thought was buried with Harlan. And that discovery, that understanding it was going to change their strategy, was going to make them come harder, was going to escalate conflict, but escalation was fine, was expected, was part of process because Alice had warned me, had said they'll try money first, then threats, then legal warfare, and we're going to meet each attempt with documentation, with evidence, with case so airtight they'll have no choice except settlement or public trial, and public trial, that would destroy them, would expose fraud, would cost them more than land was worth, would damage reputation, would invite federal investigation, would open them to shareholder lawsuits, would create cascade of consequences they couldn't control, couldn't contain, couldn't buy their way out of, and knowing that, understanding that we held weapons they feared, that gave me power, gave me leverage, gave me certainty that fight was winnable, that justice was achievable, that girl with nothing could defeat corporation. With everything, because nothing included determination they couldn't match, included righteousness they couldn't claim, included evidence they couldn't refute, and evidence, real evidence, properly preserved, meticulously documented, that was more powerful than money, was more dangerous than lawyers, was weapon that couldn't be bought, couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be made to disappear, and Harlan had known that, had understood that, had spent dying months creating arsenal that would outlast him, that would wait for heir who'd use it properly, and I was that heir, was exactly right person, was girl who'd survived everything, who'd lost everything, who had nothing left except this fight, and people with nothing left to lose, people who'd been abandoned by family, beaten by stepfather, thrown into wilderness, forced to give birth alone. Those people were dangerous, were unstoppable, were exactly wrong enemy to make, and Ridgewell had made me, had created me through their theft of Harlan's discovery, through their fraud, through their certainty that they could bury evidence and silence witnesses and face no consequences, except consequences had come. We're here, we're 17-year-old girl with baby and journal and vault full of evidence and lawyer who believed, and that belief, that commitment, that partnership between girl who'd survived and woman who'd spent career fighting injustice, that was unstoppable, was inevitable victory, was collapse of corporation, that thought it was untouchable. The court proceedings took 11 months of Alice being relentless, of her deposing former Ridgewell employees, subpoenaing internal documents, presenting Harlan's evidence with precision of someone who understood that 30 years of patience deserved 30 years of thoroughness, and Ridgewell fought, challenged adverse possession timeline, questioned my standing as Harlan's heir, hired experts who disputed mineral surveys, filed motion after motion, delay after delay, legal equivalent of siege designed to exhaust defenders' resources. But Alice had anticipated every move. Chain of habitation was documented in Harlan's journal, in Silas's maintenance records, in my own daily tallies. Genetic connection was established through county records tracing Thomas Price to Harlan Voss, and fraud evidence was so comprehensive, so meticulously preserved that Ridgewell's own experts couldn't dispute it without contradicting documents bearing their executive signatures. And judge ruled in March, 1 year and 1 month after I'd walked down mountain with newborn strapped to chest. Adverse possession claim was granted. Land was mine. Fraud complaint was upheld. Ridgewell was ordered to pay restitution based on estimated value of mineral rights they'd attempted to fraudulently acquire, and when Alice called to deliver that figure, when she said the number, I sat down on porch step and stared at tree line for a very long time because number was large, was life-changing, was enough to ensure Rose would never go hungry, never go cold, never wonder if there would be enough, was enough to build real life, to create foundation, to prove that unwanted children can become wealthy women, that abandoned daughters can claim fortunes, that people who survive everything deserve everything, and I'd survived, had won, had taken Harlan's weapon and used it exactly as intended, had destroyed company that thought it could steal, had proven that fraud has consequences, that theft is costs, that 30 years is long time to wait but not too long, never too long when justice is destination, and that justice, that beautiful, terrible, necessary justice, it had arrived, had been delivered, had proven that mountain keeps what world forgets, that careful men build cases that outlast them, that granddaughters inherit not just money but purpose, and that purpose, that fight, that determination to make wrong things right, it had carried me from wilderness to courtroom, from nothing to everything, from victim to victor, and that transformation, that journey, it was complete, was finished, was exactly what Harlan had hoped for, what Silas had protected, what I'd fought for, and standing on porch of cabin that was legally mine, holding daughter, who is heir to fortune, watching tree line where Silas was buried under cairn of creek stones, I understood that I'd done it, had actually done it, had survived Dale and Charlene and wilderness and winter and birth and death. And legal warfare and corporate intimidation, had emerged not broken but strengthened, not destroyed but victorious, Not crushed but elevated, and that elevation, that rising from girl who'd been thrown away to woman who'd claimed everything, it was story, was testimony, was proof that survival is possible, that justice is real, that people who think they can destroy you, who calculate that you're disposable, who decide that your life is worth less than their profit, those people can be wrong, can be defeated, can be made to pay, and watching them pay, watching Ridgewell executives sign settlement, watching corporation that had stolen from my grandfather hand over millions, watching justice delivered not through violence but through law, through evidence, through system working exactly as it should when properly used, that was satisfaction beyond anything I'd imagined, was vindication more complete than revenge, was proof that Harlan's way, the careful documentation, the patient preparation, the belief in justice, that was right way, was better way, was way that didn't just win but won permanently, won publicly, won in manner that created precedent, that warned other corporations, that demonstrated that fraud documented is fraud punished, and that punishment, those consequences, they mattered not just for me, not just for Rose, but for everyone watching, for every person who'd been wronged by powerful, for every daughter who'd been abandoned, for every child who'd been told they were worthless, because my story, my victory, it proved they were wrong, proved that worth isn't determined by people who hurt you, proved that value is inherent, is real, is something you carry inside regardless of what others say, what others believe, what others decide. And I'd carried that worth through everything, through Dale's boots and Charlene's abandonment and 3 days in wilderness and 5 months in cabin and giving birth alone and watching Silas die and raising Rose and fighting Ridgewell, had carried it because Harlan had believed in it, because Silas had protected it, because somewhere in my core I'd always known it even when everyone else denied it, and that knowing, that fundamental understanding that I mattered, that was what had saved me, was what had made survival possible, was what had transformed abandonment into liberation, was what had turned worst thing into best thing, and now standing here with Rose on my hip, with cabin behind me, with land that was mine, with fortune that was mine, with future that was mine, I understood that I wasn't just survivor, wasn't just victor, was actually teacher, was example, was proof that the people who throw you away, who decide you're disposable, who calculate that you're not worth keeping, they're wrong and proving them wrong, living well, surviving, completely, thriving abundantly, that's best revenge, that's truest victory, that's most powerful message, and my message, my story, my journey from pregnant teenager in Blizzard to woman with everything, it was message I wanted world to hear, wanted other abandoned daughters to know, wanted every person who'd been told they were worthless to understand, and understanding was this: you're not worthless, you're not disposable, you're not mistake, you're actually exactly what you need to be. You're survivor in making, you're fighter waiting to discover strength, you're person who can endure everything and emerge not destroyed but transformed, and that transformation, that alchemy of turning trauma into strength, of converting abandonment into independence, of making worst thing into catalyst for best thing, that's available to you, that's possible, that's what I did and what you can do, and doing it, surviving it, emerging from it victorious, that's not just personal triumph, is revolution, is rejection of every system that says powerful win, is proof that documented truth defeats corporate lies, is demonstration that careful preparation defeats corporate resources, is evidence that determination defeats intimidation, and I had determination, had it from beginning, had it when I walked into wilderness, had it when I gave birth alone, had it when I walked down mountain with Rose, had it when I faced Ridgewell executives, had it through every moment when quitting would have been easier than continuing, and continuing, that stubborn insistent continued existence in face of everything designed to eliminate you, that's power, that's victory, that's exactly what changes world, and world needed changing, needed to understand that children matter, that daughters have worth, that people who seem disposable are actually invaluable, and I was going to spend rest of my life proving that, was going to use my fortune, my platform, my story to help other abandoned daughters, other pregnant teenagers, other people running from violence, was going to create shelter that I'd needed, was going to provide resources that I'd lacked, was going to be person for others that Silas had been for me, and that being, that transformation from person who'd been saved to person who saves, that was purpose, was meaning, was reason survival mattered, because survival that ends with self, that doesn't extend, that doesn't help others, that's incomplete, is half-finished, is missing point, and point was this: We survive so others can survive. We fight so others can fight. We win so others can win. And winning, real winning, complete winning, it creates ripples, creates waves, creates change that extends beyond individual, beyond moment, beyond single story. And my story, my survival, my victory, it was creating change, was inspiring others, was proving that mountain keeps what world forgets, that careful men protect granddaughters they never meet, that quiet men save girls who stumble onto porches, that determined girls defeat corporations, that abandoned daughters claim fortunes, that justice delayed is sometimes justice perfected, and that perfection, that beautiful, terrible, necessary perfection, it was here, was real, was mine and Rose's and every person who needed to know that survival is possible, that fighting back works, that justice exists if you're patient enough, determined enough, documented enough, angry enough, and I was all those things, was exactly those things, was living proof that they work, that they matter, that they transform impossibility into inevitability, and that transformation, that journey, that story, it's yours too if you want it, if you're willing to fight for it, if you're ready to become person you need to be rather than person you were told to be, and becoming that conscious, deliberate transformation. That's what this was about. That's what Harlan started, what Silas continued, what I completed, and what anyone watching, what everyone who's been thrown away and told they're worthless and made to feel disposable, what you can complete too, because the mountain keeps what the world forgets. And if world has forgotten you, if family has abandoned you, if people have decided you don't matter, then come to mountain, come to place where worth is earned, not given, where survival proves value, where determination defeats everything, and build cabin, build case, build life, build future, build something that matters, something real, something yours, and when you've built it, when you've claimed it, when you've won it, remember where you came from. Remember who helped you. Remember that survival that ends with self is incomplete, and extend your hand to next person stumbling through wilderness, next pregnant teenager running from violence, next daughter who's been abandoned, and be for them what Silas was for me, what Harlan was for all of us, what mountain has always been for people who don't fit anywhere else. Be shelter, be warmth, be evidence that kindness exists, that justice is real, that survival is possible. And if you've made it this far, if you've watched this entire story, if you've seen how girl with nothing became woman with everything, then you understand, then you know, then you're ready for next story, for next journey, for next proof that people who seem powerless are actually most powerful, that people who've lost everything have nothing left to lose, that people with nothing left to lose are dangerous, are unstoppable, are exactly what world needs to change it, to fix it, to make it place where children matter, where daughters are valued, where people are protected, and that world, that better world, it's being built one story at a time, one survival at a time, one victory at a time, and my story, my survival, my victory, it's part of that building, and your story, your survival, your victory, when it comes, and it will come if you fight for it, that'll be part of it too. And together, all these stories, all these survivals, all these victories, they create something larger than individual. Create movement, create change, create world where Dales don't win, where Charlene's face consequences, where Ridgewells pay for fraud, where Harlans build legacies, where Silas's save lives, where Nolas survive everything, and that surviving, that collective determined continued existence, that's revolution. That's justice. That's exactly what the powerful fear most. And they should fear it, should fear us, should fear everyone who's been abandoned and survived, who's been attacked and fought back, who's been stolen from and reclaimed, because we're coming, we're building, we're winning, and winning, real winning, permanent winning. It's inevitable. It's here, it's now, it's me and you and everyone who refuses to die quietly, who refuses to accept being disposable, who refuses to let powerful decide our worth. And that refusal, that fundamental rejection of their authority to determine our value, that's power, that's freedom, that's everything, and I have it and Rose will have it, and you can have it too, and having it, claiming it, using it to build something beautiful from something terrible, that's the point, that's the purpose, that's exactly why Harlan documented, why Silas protected, why I fought. Why you're watching, why any of this matters, because it does matter. You matter, survival matters, justice matters, and together, all of us who matter, we're unstoppable.